The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the elite Technical Institute of Engineering as Sarah Chin sat in her 15-year-old Honda Civic, hands gripping the steering wheel. The engine ticked as it cooled, a familiar sound that usually brought her comfort. Today, it only reminded her of how out of place she was about to be. Through the windshield, she watched other families arriving for the scholarship interviews. Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, even a Tesla or two glided into parking spaces with the quiet confidence of people who belonged here. Parents emerged wearing clothes that cost more than Sarah made in a month. Their children dressed in crisp blazers and polished shoes that had never seen the inside of an auto shop. "Mom, we don't have to do this," Emma said softly from the passenger seat. At 17, Emma Chin possessed a brilliant mind, trapped in the body of a girl who'd grown up changing oil and rebuilding transmissions. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore her best dress, a simple blue number they'd found at a thrift store and carefully altered to fit perfectly. Sarah turned to study her daughter's face. Emma had inherited her father's gentle eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. More importantly, she'd inherited a mechanical intuition that bordered on supernatural. Sarah had watched Emma diagnose engine problems that stumped mechanics with decades of experience. She'd seen her daughter design improvements to fuel injection systems that could revolutionize automotive efficiency. But none of that would matter if the people inside that building couldn't see past their assumptions. "Sweetheart," Sarah said, reaching over to squeeze Emma's hand. "I've worked 3 jobs for 17 years to get you to this moment. I've changed oil at 5 in the morning and rebuilt engines until midnight. I've missed school plays and parent-teacher conferences because I was working to keep food on our table and save every penny for your education. We're not turning back now." Emma nodded, but Sarah could see the fear in her eyes. They both knew what they were walking into. The elite Technical Institute wasn't just a school, it was a fortress of privilege, a place where connections mattered more than competence, where the right last name could open doors that talent alone never could. Sarah looked down at her own hands, permanently stained with motor oil, despite the industrial soap she'd scrubbed with that morning. Her nails were short and practical, her palms calloused from years of gripping wrenches and lifting heavy parts. She wore her best outfit, a simple black blazer over dark jeans and a white blouse, but she knew it wouldn't fool anyone. She looked exactly like what she was, a working-class single mother who'd spent her life in garages and auto shops. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that those same oil-stained hands had once held championship trophies, that the woman they were about to dismiss as just a mechanic had once been the most feared pit crew chief in NASCAR history. But that was a lifetime ago, before tragedy changed everything, before she'd chosen anonymity over fame, sacrifice over glory. Now, watching her daughter prepare to face the same kind of prejudice she'd once fought against, Sarah wondered if she'd made the right choice in staying silent all these years. "Ready?" Emma asked, though her voice betrayed her nervousness. Sarah took a deep breath, tasting the familiar mixture of motor oil and determination that had sustained her through 17 years of single parenthood. "Let's go show them what we're made of." They walked across the parking lot together, their footsteps echoing off the pristine concrete. The elite Technical Institute rose before them like a monument to academic achievement, all glass and steel and carefully manicured landscaping. Sarah had driven past this building hundreds of times over the years, never imagining she'd one day walk through its doors. The lobby was everything she'd expected, and worse. Marble floors reflected the light from crystal chandeliers, while oil paintings of distinguished alumni gazed down from mahogany-paneled walls. Students and parents moved through the space with the casual confidence of people who'd never doubted their right to be there. Sarah felt every eye in the room assess and dismiss her in a span of seconds. She was used to it, the quick glance that took in her practical clothes and working-class appearance, the subtle shift in posture that said, "Not one of us." But watching it happen to Emma, seeing her brilliant daughter shrink under those judgmental stares, ignited something fierce and protective in Sarah's chest. Sarah Chin. A young woman with a clipboard and a practiced smile approached them. I'm Jennifer, Professor Thornfield's assistant. He's ready to begin the interviews. They followed Jennifer down a hallway lined with photographs of successful graduates, CEOs, inventors, Nobel Prize winners. All men, Sarah noticed. All white. All wearing the same expression of entitled confidence that she learned to recognize and navigate around. The conference room was intimidating by design. A massive oak table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the campus quad, where students who'd already made it past the gatekeepers strolled between classes with their expensive backpacks and designer coffee cups. Professor Marcus Thornfield stood at the head of the table, reviewing a stack of applications with the air of a man accustomed to holding other people's futures in his hands. At 35, he was younger than Sarah had expected, but he carried himself with the authority of someone who'd never been told no. His perfectly pressed khakis, expensive watch, and MIT alumni pin were carefully chosen signals of his status and success. Mrs. Chen, he said without looking up from the papers. And Emma, please, have a seat. Sarah noticed he didn't offer his hand or make eye contact. Another subtle dismissal, another way of establishing the hierarchy in the room. She'd seen it 1,000 times before, the way powerful men use small gestures to remind everyone else of their place. Emma sat down carefully, her portfolio clutched in her lap like a shield. Sarah took the seat beside her, close enough to offer support, but far enough away to let Emma shine on her own merits. I have to say, Marcus began, finally looking up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, your application is quite unique, Emma. Growing up in an auto shop, learning mechanics from your mother. It's certainly not the typical background we see here at the Institute. The way he said unique made it sound like a disease. Sarah felt her jaw clench, but she forced herself to remain silent. This was Emma's moment. Yes, sir, Emma replied, her voice steady despite her nerves. I've been working with engines since I was old enough to hold a wrench. My mother taught me that understanding how things work is the foundation of being able to improve them. Marcus made a note on his pad. And tell me, what makes you think that practical experience translates to the kind of theoretical knowledge required for advanced engineering? Sarah wanted to scream. She wanted to tell this arrogant professor that her daughter could diagnose problems he'd never even heard of, that Emma understood thermodynamics and fluid mechanics in ways that no textbook could teach. But she bit her tongue and let Emma answer. Sir, every engine is a complex system of interconnected parts. Understanding how they work together, how changes in one component affect the whole system, that's engineering. Whether you're optimizing fuel injection timing or designing a new transmission, the principles are the same. Marcus nodded absently, clearly unimpressed. I see. And your grades are adequate, though I notice you attended public school. We find that students from more rigorous academic backgrounds tend to perform better in our program. The dismissal was so casual, so matter-of-fact, that it took Sarah's breath away. Emma had maintained a 4.0 GPA while working part-time at the shop, had taught herself advanced calculus and physics, had designed innovations that could change the automotive industry. But because she hadn't attended some elite prep school, her achievements were merely adequate. Professor Thornfield, Sarah said, unable to stay silent any longer, Emma has been accepted to MIT, Stanford, and Caltech. Her SAT scores are in the 99th percentile. I think her academic record speaks for itself. Marcus turned to her with a kind of patronizing smile, usually reserved for children and pets. Of course, Mrs. Chen. I'm sure you're very proud. But you have to understand, we're not just looking for good test scores. We're looking for students who can thrive in our particular environment. Students who understand the culture of excellence we've cultivated here. The subtext was clear. Students like us. Students from the right families, with the right connections, who'd never had to work for anything in their lives. What exactly do you mean by culture of excellence? Sarah asked, her voice carefully controlled. Well, Marcus leaned back in his chair, warming to his theme. Engineering is about precision, about following established protocols. It's about understanding that there are right ways and wrong ways to approach problems. Students who come from more informal learning environments sometimes struggle with the discipline required for serious academic work. Sarah felt something cold and dangerous settle in her stomach. She'd heard variations of this speech before, back when she was fighting to be taken seriously in the male-dominated world of professional racing. The same coded language, the same polite dismissal, the same assumption that people like her didn't belong in places like this. I see, she said quietly. And what would you say to someone who suggested that innovation often comes from approaching problems in new ways? That sometimes the most important breakthroughs come from people who haven't been taught that something is impossible? Marcus's smile became even more condescending. Mrs. Chen, I appreciate your optimism, but engineering is a serious field. It requires years of rigorous training, proper mentorship, and frankly, the right kind of background. We can't simply let enthusiasm substitute for expertise. Emma's face had gone pale, but Sarah could see the fire building in her daughter's eyes. The same fire that had driven Sarah to fight her way to the top of her profession, the same stubborn refusal to accept other people's limitations. Sir, Emma said, her voice gaining strength, with respect, I think you might be underestimating what I've learned. I've rebuilt engines from the ground up, designed modifications that improved performance by 15%, and solved problems that stumped mechanics with decades of experience. I may not have learned it in a classroom, but I understand engineering. Marcus made another note, his expression suggesting he was humoring a child. I'm sure you do, Emma. But there's a difference between tinkering with cars and understanding the theoretical foundations of mechanical engineering. Can you derive the Navier-Stokes equations? Do you understand the principles of finite element analysis? Have you studied materials science at the molecular level? Sarah watched her daughter's confidence crumble. Emma knew engines better than anyone Sarah had ever met, but she'd never heard of the Navier-Stokes equations. She understood fluid dynamics intuitively, but she couldn't recite the mathematical formulas that described them. No, sir, but I could learn. Of course you could, Marcus interrupted smoothly. But you'd be starting from behind. Our other candidates have been preparing for this their entire lives. They've had the best tutors, the most advanced coursework, the kind of comprehensive education that money can buy. It's not your fault that you haven't had those advantages, but we have to be realistic about what that means for your chances of success here. The room fell silent, except for the soft tick of an expensive clock on the wall. Sarah looked at her daughter's face and saw 17 years of dreams crashing down. Emma had worked so hard, had sacrificed so much, had believed that talent and determination would be enough. Now she was learning the harsh truth that Sarah had tried to shield her from, that in a world built on privilege and connections, merit alone was rarely sufficient. But Sarah had learned something else in her years of fighting for respect in a hostile industry. Sometimes you had to make people see you differently. Sometimes you had to force them to confront their assumptions. And sometimes the only way to protect the people you loved was to stop hiding who you really were. Professor Thornfield, Sarah said, her voice carrying a new edge. I think you're making some assumptions about Emma's background that might not be entirely accurate. Marcus turned to her with barely concealed irritation. Mrs. Chen, I appreciate your concern for your daughter, but you mentioned theoretical foundations, Sarah continued, cutting him off. Tell me, are you familiar with the Martinez protocol? Something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Surprise, maybe even recognition. What does that have to do with anything? It's a diagnostic system used in high-performance racing. Very specialized, very advanced. The kind of thing that requires deep understanding of both theoretical principles and practical application. Sarah's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. I'm curious whether you've encountered it in your academic work. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I may have come across references to it. But again, I don't see how this relates to Emma's application. It relates, Sarah said, standing up slowly, because the person who developed the Martinez Protocol is sitting in this room right now. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time, his confident demeanor cracking slightly. "That's impossible," he said finally. "The Martinez Protocol was developed by Sarah Martinez, the NASCAR engineer. She disappeared from racing 15 years ago after he stopped, his eyes widening as the pieces fell into place. After her husband died in a racing accident, Sarah finished quietly. After she had a baby daughter to raise and decided that being a mother was more important than being famous." Emma was staring at her mother in shock, her mouth slightly open. "Mom, you were a NASCAR engineer?" Sarah reached over and took her daughter's hand. "I was a lot of things, sweetheart. But the most important thing I ever became was your mother." Marcus had gone very pale. "You're Sarah Martinez, the Sarah Martinez, five-time Cup Series champion pit crew chief, three-time Daytona 500 winner. You revolutionized pit stop strategy and developed half the diagnostic protocols still used in professional racing." "I was good at my job," Sarah said simply, "just like Emma is good at hers." But you've been working as a mechanic in a regular auto shop for 17 years. Marcus seemed unable to process this information. "I've been raising my daughter and supporting my family," Sarah corrected. "The work I do now is just as important as the work I did then. More important, actually, because it's allowed me to give Emma the foundation she needed to become the engineer she's meant to be." She turned to Emma, whose eyes were bright with tears and wonder. "Sweetheart, I never told you about my past because I wanted you to succeed on your own merits. I wanted you to know that your worth isn't determined by my achievements or anyone else's expectations. You are brilliant and capable and deserving of every opportunity, not because of who I used to be, but because of who you are." Emma squeezed her mother's hand, understanding flooding her face. "That's why you always knew exactly what was wrong with every car that came into the shop. That's why you could solve problems that other mechanics couldn't figure out. That's why I could teach you to see patterns that others miss," Sarah agreed. "That's why I could show you that engineering isn't about memorizing formulas. It's about understanding how systems work and having the creativity to make them work better." Marcus was still staring at them both, his worldview clearly shaken. I don't understand. Why didn't you say something earlier? Why let me assume?" "Because," Sarah said, her voice hardening, "I wanted to see how you would treat my daughter when you thought she was just another working-class kid with big dreams. I wanted to see whether you would judge her on her merits or on your assumptions about her background." The accusation hung in the air, like smoke. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again, perhaps realizing that anything he said would only make things worse. "And now I know," Sarah continued. "Now I know that you were prepared to dismiss one of the most talented young engineers I've ever met because she didn't fit your narrow definition of what a successful student looks like. Now I know that you've been using my work, my innovations, my protocols, my techniques to teach your students while simultaneously dismissing the very kind of practical experience that made those innovations possible." She stood up, her full height making her seem suddenly formidable. "Professor Thornfield, I've spent my career fighting against people who thought they knew better than me because of how I looked or where I came from. I won't let my daughter face that same prejudice, especially not from someone who's built his reputation on work that people like me made possible." Marcus was sweating now, his carefully constructed authority crumbling. Miss Martinez, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Sarah said firmly. "Just a revelation. You've shown me exactly who you are and what this institution values. The question now is what you're going to do about it." Before Marcus could respond, the conference room door opened and Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the institute's dean, stepped inside. She was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Professor Thornfield, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I need to speak with you. There's been a complaint filed about your interview methods. Marcus went even paler. Dr. Rodriguez, I was just conducting a thorough evaluation. You were conducting an interrogation designed to eliminate a qualified candidate based on socioeconomic bias, Dr. Rodriguez said crisply. I've been listening from the hallway for the past 10 minutes, and what I heard was deeply troubling. She turned to Sarah and Emma, her expression softening slightly. Miss Martinez? Chen. Miss Chen. I owe you both a profound apology. This is not how we conduct business at the Elite Technical Institute, and it's certainly not how we treat prospective students or their families. Sarah studied the dean's face, looking for signs of the same prejudice she'd encountered from Marcus. Instead, she saw genuine remorse and what appeared to be sincere respect. Dr. Rodriguez, Sarah said carefully, I appreciate your apology, but I'm more concerned about what this says about your institution's values. If this is how Professor Thornfield treats students who don't fit his preconceptions, how many other talented young people have been turned away because they didn't have the right background or connections? Dr. Rodriguez nodded grimly. That's exactly what I intend to find out. Professor Thornfield, you and I will be having a very serious conversation about your evaluation methods and your apparent bias against students from non-traditional backgrounds. She turned back to Sarah and Emma. Miss Chen, I hope you'll give us another chance to properly evaluate your application. Based on what I've heard today, you're exactly the kind of innovative thinker we need more of in our program. Emma looked at her mother uncertainly. Sarah could see the hope and fear warring in her daughter's eyes. After everything that had happened, after all the assumptions and dismissals, did they really want to be part of an institution that had treated them so poorly? But Sarah also saw something else in Emma's face, determination, the same stubborn refusal to give up that had carried Sarah through her own battles against prejudice and discrimination. Emma wanted this opportunity, not because she needed their validation, but because she knew she could make a difference. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah asked. Dr. Rodriguez smiled for the first time since entering the room. A proper interview conducted by faculty members who understand that innovation comes from diverse perspectives and experiences. A fair evaluation based on Emma's actual qualifications rather than assumptions about her background. She paused, then added, and perhaps a conversation about how someone with your expertise might contribute to our program. We've been looking for ways to bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Your experience could be invaluable in helping our students understand that engineering isn't just about formulas and equations. It's about solving real-world problems. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. For 17 years, she'd hidden her past, content to work in anonymity while raising her daughter. But maybe it was time to step back into the light. Maybe it was time to use her experience and reputation to help other students who face the same barriers Emma had encountered. I'll consider it, she said finally. But first, I want to see how you handle Emma's application. I want to know that she'll be judged fairly, that she'll be given the same opportunities as every other student. You have my word, Dr. Rodriguez said solemnly. And Professor Thornfield, you have my word that we'll be reviewing your evaluation methods very carefully. Marcus had been silent throughout this exchange, his face a mask of humiliation and fear. Now he cleared his throat nervously. Ms. Martinez-Shen, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I owe you and Emma an apology. I let my preconceptions cloud my judgment. I treated you both unfairly, and I'm deeply sorry. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of sincerity. She'd heard plenty of apologies over the years, some genuine, others merely strategic. This one seemed to fall somewhere in between. Professor Thornfield, she said finally, apologies are meaningless without change. The question is whether you've learned anything from this experience or whether you'll go back to making the same assumptions about the next student who doesn't fit your narrow definition of what an engineer should look like. Marcus nodded slowly. I think I have a lot to learn about my own biases, about what really makes a good engineer. I hope you'll give me the chance to do better. Sarah looked at Emma, who was watching the exchange with fascination. Her daughter had just witnessed a master class in standing up to authority, in refusing to accept unfair treatment, in using truth as a weapon against prejudice. We'll see, Sarah said simply. Actions speak louder than words, Professor. I'll be watching to see what yours say about who you really are. 3 days later, Sarah and Emma returned to the Elite Technical Institute for what Dr. Rodriguez had promised would be a fair and comprehensive evaluation. This time, they were met not by Marcus Thornfield, but by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the head of the Mechanical Engineering Department, and Dr. David Kim, a professor specializing in automotive systems. The atmosphere was completely different from their first visit. Instead of the intimidating conference room, they were taken to a working laboratory filled with engines, diagnostic equipment, and the familiar smell of motor oil and metal. Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as she breathed in the sense of her professional life. Emma, Dr. Walsh said warmly, we've reviewed your application materials and we're very impressed. Your design for the modified fuel injection system is particularly innovative. We'd like to see how you approach problem solving in a practical setting. She gestured toward a workbench where a partially disassembled engine sat waiting. This is a hybrid power unit from a Formula One car. It's been experiencing performance issues, and our graduate students have been trying to diagnose the problem for several weeks. We'd like to see what you can determine. Emma approached the engine with the confidence that came from years of hands-on experience. Sarah watched her daughter's face transform as she entered what Sarah privately called diagnostic mode, the intense focus that blocked out everything except the mechanical puzzle in front of her. May I touch it? Emma asked. Of course, Dr. Kim replied. This is a working lab. We believe in learning by doing. Emma's hands moved over the engine with practiced precision, checking connections, testing components, listening to the subtle sounds that could reveal hidden problems. Sarah felt a surge of pride watching her daughter work. This was Emma in her element, doing what she was born to do. The turbocharger has been disconnected, Emma said after a few minutes, but that's obviously intentional for the diagnostic. The real issue is more subtle. She paused, frowning as she examined a particular component. Someone's introduced metal shavings into the oil circulation system, but not randomly. They're placed in specific locations that would cause maximum damage while being difficult to detect. Dr. Walsh and Dr. Kim exchanged glances. Go on, Dr. Walsh encouraged. The ERSK motor generator unit has been deliberately misaligned, Emma continued, her voice growing more confident as she worked. And the fuel injection timing has been altered using a very specific technique. This isn't random sabotage, this is systematic. Someone who really understands these engines created a series of interconnected failures that would be nearly impossible to diagnose without. She trailed off, her eyes widening as she looked more closely at the modifications. Without what? Dr. Kim prompted. Without knowing exactly how Formula One pit crews approach diagnostics under time pressure, Emma finished. This is designed to test systematic thinking, to see if someone can look beyond the obvious problems to find the root cause. Sarah felt her heart swell with pride. Emma had not only diagnosed the problems correctly, but had also recognized the sophisticated nature of the test itself. That's remarkable, Dr. Walsh said, genuine admiration in her voice. You've identified issues that our graduate students missed, and you've done it in a fraction of the time. But there's more, Emma said, still studying the engine. Whoever set this up used a very specific protocol. The placement of the metal shavings, the particular way the timing was altered. It's not just systematic, it's elegant. It's the work of someone who doesn't just understand engines, but understands how to teach people to understand engines. She looked up at the professors, then at her mother. This is the Martinez protocol, isn't it? The diagnostic training system my mother developed. Dr. Kim nodded slowly. We've been using modified versions of your mother's protocols to train our students for years. It's one of the most effective diagnostic systems ever developed. But how did you know? Dr. Walsh asked Emma. The Martinez protocol isn't published in any textbook. It's proprietary information that's only shared with select racing teams and training programs. Emma smiled, the first truly relaxed expression Sarah had seen on her daughter's face since this whole process began. Because my mother taught me to think like an engineer, not just to memorize formulas. She taught me to see patterns, to understand systems, to approach problems systematically. She taught me the Martinez protocol without ever telling me that's what it was called. Sarah stepped forward, unable to stay silent any longer. I taught her to think the way I learned to think when I was developing those protocols. The principles are the same, whether you're training pit crews for NASCAR or teaching a teenager to diagnose transmission problems. Dr. Walsh turned to Sarah with obvious respect. Miss Martinez-Shin, we've been hoping to meet you for years. Your work revolutionized not just racing, but automotive engineering education. The protocols you developed have been adapted for use in universities around the world. I'm glad they've been useful, Sarah said simply. But I developed them to solve practical problems, not to create academic exercises. The real test isn't whether someone can memorize the steps, it's whether they can apply the thinking behind them to new situations. Which is exactly what Emma just did, Dr. Kim observed. She didn't just diagnose the problems, she understood the meta-problem. She recognized that this was a teaching tool and grasped the principles behind its design. Emma was beaming now, her earlier nervousness completely gone. So does this mean I passed? Dr. Walsh laughed. Emma, you didn't just pass. You exceeded our expectations in ways we didn't think were possible. Your combination of practical experience and intuitive understanding is exactly what we're looking for in our program. But more than that, Dr. Kim added, you've shown us something important about our own assumptions. We've been so focused on traditional academic preparation that we've overlooked the value of hands-on experience. Your approach to problem solving is fresh and innovative, precisely because you learn to think about engines as living systems rather than abstract concepts. Sarah felt a weight she'd been carrying for 17 years finally lift from her shoulders. Emma was going to be fine. More than fine. She was going to thrive. And she was going to do it on her own terms, bringing her unique perspective to a field that desperately needed new ways of thinking. There's something else we'd like to discuss, Dr. Walsh said, turning to Sarah. We've been looking for ways to incorporate more practical, hands-on learning into our curriculum. Our students are brilliant theoretically, but many of them struggle when they encounter real-world problems that don't match the textbook examples. You want me to teach? Sarah said. It wasn't a question. We want you to help us bridge the gap between theory and practice, Dr. Kim corrected, to show our students that engineering isn't just about calculations, it's about understanding how things work in the real world under real conditions with real constraints. Sarah looked at Emma, who was nodding enthusiastically. Mom, you should do it. You're an amazing teacher. You taught me everything I know. I taught you to think for yourself, Sarah corrected. That's different from teaching a classroom full of students who've been trained to memorize and regurgitate. Which is exactly why we need you, Dr. Walsh said. Our students need to learn that there's more than one way to approach a problem, that innovation comes from questioning assumptions and thinking creatively. Sarah considered the offer. For 17 years, she'd been content to work in anonymity, to let others take credit for innovation she'd helped develop. But watching Emma face prejudice and dismissal had reminded her of why she'd fought so hard to succeed in the first place. It wasn't just about personal achievement, it was about opening doors for others, about proving that talent and determination mattered more than background and connections. I'll consider it, she said finally. But I have conditions. Name them, Dr. Walsh said immediately. First, I want to see real changes in how you evaluate and support students from non-traditional backgrounds. Emma shouldn't be the exception. She should be the beginning of a new approach to identifying and nurturing talent. Agreed, Dr. Kim said. We've already begun reviewing our admission processes and evaluation criteria. Second, I want to work with students who might not otherwise have access to this kind of education. Outreach programs, community partnerships, scholarships for kids who show promise but don't have the resources to pursue traditional preparation. We've been wanting to expand our community engagement, Dr. Walsh said. Your involvement would give us credibility and expertise we currently lack. And third, Sarah said, her voice growing firm, I want assurance that what happened with Professor Thornfield won't happen again. I want to know that students will be judged on their abilities, not on assumptions about their backgrounds. Dr. Walsh and Dr. Kim exchanged glances. Professor Thornfield has been placed on administrative leave pending a full review of his evaluation methods, Dr. Walsh said carefully. We take these issues very seriously. Good, Sarah said, because talent comes from everywhere, and if you're only looking in traditional places, you're missing most of it. Emma had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement. Mom, this is perfect. You could help other students like me, students who know how to solve problems but haven't had the chance to learn the academic language. Sarah smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm. It would mean a big change for both of us. I'd have to leave the shop, start over in a completely different environment. But you wouldn't really be starting over, Emma pointed out. You'd be going back to what you were always meant to do, just in a different way. Sarah looked around the laboratory, taking in the familiar sights and smells of serious engineering work. She thought about the students who might benefit from her experience, the innovations that might come from combining theoretical knowledge with practical wisdom, the barriers that might be broken down by proving that excellence came in many forms. All right, she said finally. Let's do it. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of a lecture hall filled with engineering students, but this wasn't like any traditional classroom. Half the space was set up with workbenches, diagnostic equipment, and actual engines in various states of assembly. The other half contained whiteboards covered with equations and diagrams that connected theoretical principles to real-world applications. Good morning, Sarah said, her voice carrying easily to the back of the room. I'm Professor Martina Shin, and this is Applied Engineering Systems. Before we begin, I want you to forget everything you think you know about how engineering is supposed to be taught. She gestured toward the engines on the workbenches. These aren't props or demonstrations. They're your textbooks. Over the next semester, you're going to learn thermodynamics by feeling how heat moves through metal. You're going to understand fluid mechanics by watching oil flow through passages. You're going to grasp material science by seeing how different alloys respond to stress. A student in the front row raised her hand. Professor, how does this relate to the theoretical coursework we're taking in other classes? Sarah smiled. Excellent question, Maria. The theory and the practice aren't separate things. They're different ways of describing the same reality. When you understand both, you can innovate in ways that pure theorists or pure practitioners never could. She walked over to one of the engines and placed her hand on the block. This engine represents thousands of hours of theoretical calculation, thermodynamic cycles, materials analysis, fluid flow modeling. But it also represents thousands of hours of practical experience, understanding how parts wear, how systems fail, how real-world conditions affect performance. The magic happens, she continued, when you can move fluidly between both worlds. When you can feel a vibration and immediately know which equation describes it. When you can see a formula and instantly visualize what it means in terms of actual mechanical behavior. Emma, who was auditing the class as a first-year student, raised her hand. Professor, can you give us an example? Sarah grinned at her daughter's slip. Certainly. Who can tell me the formula for calculating the efficiency of a heat engine? Several hands went up. Sarah called on a student named James, whose father was a prominent automotive executive. Efficiency equals 1 minus the ratio of cold reservoir temperature to hot reservoir temperature, James recited perfectly. Correct, Sarah said. Now, James, what does that actually mean? James looked confused. It It means that efficiency depends on the temperature difference between the hot and cold sides of the engine? Right. But what does that feel like? What does it sound like? How would you recognize it if you encountered it in the real world? James was clearly struggling. Like many of the students, he could manipulate the equations perfectly, but had no intuitive understanding of what they represented. Sarah walked over to one of the engines and started it up. The room filled with the familiar rumble of internal combustion. "Listen," she said over the noise. "What do you hear?" "An engine running?" James ventured. "You hear thermodynamics in action," Sarah corrected. "Every explosion in those cylinders is a heat engine cycle. The efficiency we just calculated determines how much of the energy in the gasoline gets converted to useful work and how much gets wasted as heat." She placed her hand on the exhaust manifold, then quickly pulled it away. "Feel that heat? That's inefficiency made tangible. Every BTU flowing out through this exhaust system represents energy that didn't get converted to motion." She turned to the class. "Now, who can tell me 3 practical ways to improve the efficiency of this engine?" This time, Emma's hand shot up, along with several others. But Sarah noticed that the students who raised their hands weren't necessarily the ones with the highest GPAs. They were the ones who'd been listening, not just with their minds, but with their intuition. "Emma, increase the compression ratio to raise the effective temperature of the hot reservoir, improve the cooling system to lower the temperature of the cold reservoir, and reduce friction losses so more of the theoretical work actually reaches the wheels." "Excellent. And Marcus?" Marcus Thompson, a student from a working-class background who'd been struggling in his theoretical courses, spoke up confidently. "You could also optimize the intake and exhaust systems to improve volumetric efficiency, use variable valve timing to optimize the cycle for different operating conditions, and maybe add a turbocharger to recover energy from the exhaust gases." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Outstanding. Marcus, your suggestions show deep understanding of how these systems actually work. The fact that you're struggling with some of the mathematical formulations doesn't mean you don't understand engineering. It just means you need to learn a different language to describe what you already know." She turned to address the entire class. "This is why we're here. Not to choose between theory and practice, but to master both. Not to privilege one way of knowing over another, but to develop the full range of tools that make great engineers." Over the following weeks, Sarah watched her students transform. The theoretically gifted ones learned to trust their hands and their intuition. The practically minded ones gained confidence in their ability to master abstract concepts. Most importantly, they all learned to see engineering as a creative, collaborative discipline rather than a series of problems with predetermined solutions. The changes weren't limited to Sarah's classroom. Word of her innovative teaching methods spread throughout the department, and other professors began incorporating more hands-on elements into their courses. Dr. Walsh started a mentorship program, pairing students from different backgrounds, while Dr. Kim developed new assessment methods that valued creative problem-solving alongside mathematical precision. But perhaps the most significant change was in the culture of the institution itself. The Elite Technical Institute began actively recruiting students from community colleges, trade schools, and non-traditional backgrounds. They established partnerships with high schools and underserved communities and created bridge programs to help talented students overcome gaps in their preparation. Professor Thornfield, after completing a comprehensive review of his teaching methods and undergoing bias training, returned to the classroom with a dramatically different approach. He began each semester by acknowledging his own past mistakes and challenging his students to question assumptions, including his own. "I used to think," he told his new class, "that engineering was about following established protocols, about doing things the right way. But I've learned that innovation comes from questioning those protocols, from bringing new perspectives to old problems. Some of the most important insights in this field have come from people who didn't know that something was supposed to be impossible." The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some faculty members resisted the changes, arguing that lowering standards would diminish the institution's reputation. Some alumni complained that the school was abandoning its traditions. Some students struggled with the increased emphasis on creative thinking and practical application. But the results spoke for themselves. Student retention rates improved dramatically, particularly among underrepresented groups. Graduate employment rates reached all-time highs as companies discovered that the school's graduates could not only perform calculations but also solve real-world problems creatively and effectively. Most importantly, the students themselves were different. They were more confident, more collaborative, more willing to take intellectual risks. They saw engineering not as a narrow technical discipline, but as a way of thinking that could be applied to any challenge. Emma thrived in this environment, quickly establishing herself as one of the most promising students in her class. But she also became an advocate for other students who faced the same barriers she had encountered, working with her mother to develop new outreach programs and support systems. "You know what I've learned?" Emma said to Sarah one evening as they walked across the campus together. "It's not enough to succeed yourself. You have to make sure the door stays open for the people coming behind you." Sarah smiled, remembering her own journey from NASCAR champion to anonymous mechanic to respected professor. "That's the most important lesson of all, sweetheart. Success isn't just about what you achieve, it's about what you make possible for others." 2 years after Sarah's first day as a professor, the Elite Technical Institute hosted its first annual conference on innovation and engineering education. Representatives from universities around the world had come to learn about the school's transformation and to share their own efforts to make engineering education more inclusive and effective. Sarah stood at the podium in the main auditorium, looking out at an audience that included students, faculty, industry leaders, and education reformers. Emma sat in the front row, now a junior, with a perfect GPA and 3 internship offers from major automotive companies. "When I first walked into this institution," Sarah began, "I was just a mother trying to help her daughter get a fair chance at education. I had no intention of becoming a professor, no plan to challenge anyone's assumptions about how engineering should be taught." She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the diverse audience. "But sometimes life forces you to confront the gap between what is and what should be. Sometimes you realize that staying silent isn't protecting anyone, it's just perpetuating a system that wastes human potential." The story I want to tell you today isn't really about me or even about Emma. It's about all the students who never got the chance to show what they could do because they didn't fit someone's narrow definition of what an engineer should look like. She clicked to her first slide, which showed statistics on engineering enrollment and graduation rates, broken down by demographic categories. These numbers tell a story of systematic exclusion, not intentional perhaps, but exclusion nonetheless. When we define merit in ways that privilege certain backgrounds and experiences, we don't just harm individual students, we impoverish the entire field. The next slide showed a Formula One engine, the same type Emma had diagnosed during her evaluation. This engine represents the pinnacle of automotive engineering. Every component has been optimized through countless iterations, every system refined through years of competition. But do you know what made the biggest difference in its development? She paused for effect. Diversity of thought. The breakthrough innovations didn't come from teams of identical engineers following identical processes. They came from bringing together people with different backgrounds, different ways of seeing problems, different approaches to finding solutions. A mechanical engineer might optimize the combustion process. A materials scientist might develop lighter, stronger components. A software engineer might create better control systems. But the real magic happens when someone who learned to diagnose problems by sound and feel works alongside someone who models fluid dynamics with supercomputers. Sarah clicked to the next slide, which showed before and after photos of her classroom. This is what transformation looks like in practice. Not choosing between theory and application, but integrating them. Not privileging one way of knowing over another, but recognizing that different approaches can strengthen each other. She told the story of Marcus Thompson, the working-class student who'd struggled with mathematical formulations but had an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. Marcus is now working for Tesla, where his ability to bridge the gap between theoretical design and practical manufacturing has made him invaluable. But he almost didn't make it through his first year because his professors couldn't see past his unconventional background. She told the story of Maria Santos, whose parents had immigrated from Mexico and who'd learned engineering principles by helping her father repair construction equipment. Maria is now pursuing a PhD in materials science, but she's also working with community organizations to develop low-cost water purification systems for underserved communities. Her research is informed by both cutting-edge science and deep understanding of real-world constraints. These students didn't succeed despite their backgrounds, Sarah emphasized. They succeeded because of them. Their diverse experiences gave them perspectives that traditional students lacked, insights that led to innovations that might never have emerged from more homogeneous environments. The audience was completely engaged now, leaning forward in their seats. Sarah could see nods of recognition, flashes of understanding, the kind of intellectual excitement that came from seeing familiar problems in new ways. But transformation isn't just about changing who we admit or how we teach, Sarah continued. It's about changing how we think about the purpose of education itself. She clicked to a slide showing employment statistics for the Institute's graduates. Our students aren't just getting jobs, they're creating jobs. They're starting companies, developing technologies, solving problems that previous generations of engineers couldn't even see. Why? Because they've learned to think systemically, to see connections between seemingly unrelated fields, to approach challenges with both analytical rigor and creative flexibility. They've learned that engineering isn't just about optimizing existing systems, it's about imagining entirely new possibilities. Sarah's voice grew more passionate as she reached the heart of her message. Every student we exclude because they don't fit our preconceptions is a potential innovation we'll never see. Every barrier we maintain in the name of standards is a solution we'll never discover. Every assumption we refuse to question is a future we'll never create. She clicked to her final slide, which showed a photo of Emma working alongside students from dozens of different backgrounds in the Institute's new collaborative laboratory. This is what the future of engineering looks like. Not a hierarchy based on credentials and connections, but a community based on curiosity and capability. Not a competition to see who can best reproduce existing knowledge, but a collaboration to create new understanding. The question isn't whether we can afford to make these changes, Sarah concluded. The question is whether we can afford not to. The challenges facing our world, climate change, sustainable energy, global health, social equity, are too complex and too urgent to be solved by any single perspective or approach. We need engineers who can think across disciplines, who can communicate with diverse communities, who can see problems from multiple angles, and imagine solutions that others might miss. We need engineers who understand that technical excellence and social responsibility aren't separate goals, but interconnected imperatives. Most importantly, we need engineers who remember that behind every equation is a human need, behind every system is a community impact, behind every innovation is an opportunity to make the world more just and more sustainable. The applause was thunderous and sustained. Sarah looked out at the audience and saw the faces of people who'd been inspired to think differently about their own institutions, their own assumptions, their own responsibilities as educators and leaders. During the question and answer session that followed, professors from around the world shared their own efforts to make engineering education more inclusive and effective. Industry leaders talked about the value they'd found in hiring graduates from diverse backgrounds. Students spoke about how different teaching methods had helped them discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed. But the most powerful moment came when Professor Thornfield stood up in the back of the auditorium. "Professor Martinushin," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone, "I want to thank you publicly for teaching me the most important lesson of my career." The room fell silent, everyone recognizing the significance of this moment. 2 years ago, I was guilty of exactly the kind of bias you've described. I let my assumptions about backgrounds and credentials blind me to talent and potential. I almost denied this institution one of its most promising students because I couldn't see past my own prejudices. His voice grew stronger as he continued. But you didn't just call out my mistakes. You showed me a better way. You demonstrated that excellence comes in many forms, that innovation requires diversity, that our job as educators isn't to gatekeep, but to cultivate. I'm a better teacher now because of what you taught me. My students are better engineers because they've learned to question assumptions, including their own. And this institution is better positioned to serve its mission because we've learned to recognize and nurture talent wherever we find it. The applause that followed was different from before, more personal, more emotional, more meaningful. It was the sound of people recognizing not just intellectual insight, but moral courage, not just professional achievement, but human transformation. After the conference ended, Sarah and Emma walked together across the campus that had become their second home. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and students from the evening classes were beginning to arrive. "Mom," Emma said, "do you ever regret giving up your NASCAR career?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "I used to think I'd given up everything to raise you, but now I realize I didn't give up anything. I just found a different way to use my gifts." "What do you mean?" "In racing, I helped teams win championships. That was important, and I was good at it. But here, I'm helping students discover their own potential, overcome barriers, create innovations that might change the world. The impact is broader, deeper, more lasting." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "And you're still solving problems, still pushing boundaries, still refusing to accept that things have to be the way they've always been." Exactly. The context changed, but the core mission stayed the same. Figure out how systems work, identify what's preventing them from working better, and find creative ways to improve them. They paused at the entrance to the new Martinez Chin Center for Applied Engineering, a state-of-the-art facility that combined traditional laboratories with hands-on workshops, collaborative spaces with quiet study areas, cutting-edge equipment with practical tools. "You know what I'm most proud of?" Sarah asked. "What?" "It's not the building or the program or even the students we've helped. It's the fact that you've learned the most important lesson of all, that success isn't just about what you achieve for yourself, but about what you make possible for others." Emma smiled. "I learned that from watching you, Mom. From seeing how you sacrificed your own recognition to give me opportunities, how you used your expertise to help other students, how you turned your own experience with prejudice into a force for positive change." "And now you're doing the same thing," Sarah observed. "Working with high school students, mentoring younger engineering majors, advocating for more inclusive policies. You're not just succeeding, you're making sure others can succeed too." As they walked toward the parking lot, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From that first humiliating interview with Professor Thornfield to this moment of recognition and transformation, it had been a path marked by challenges, revelations, and ultimately, hope. She thought about all the students who would benefit from the changes they'd helped implement, all the innovations that would emerge from more diverse and inclusive engineering programs, all the problems that would be solved by people who might never have had the chance to develop their potential under the old system. But most of all, she thought about Emma, brilliant, determined, compassionate Emma, who had learned not just to be an excellent engineer, but to be a force for positive change in the world. "Ready to go home?" Emma asked as they reached the car. Sarah looked back at the campus one more time, taking in the sight of students from every conceivable background, working together, learning from each other, preparing to tackle the challenges of tomorrow with both technical skill and social consciousness. "Yes," she said, getting into the driver's seat. "But you know what? I think we're already there." 5 years later, Emma Chin stood at the podium of the same auditorium, where her mother had delivered her transformative speech about innovation in engineering education. But this time, Emma was the keynote speaker at the Institute's graduation ceremony, addressing not just her fellow graduates, but also the families, faculty, and industry leaders who had come to celebrate their achievements. When I first walked into this institution, Emma began, echoing her mother's words from years before. I was just a teenager from a working-class family, hoping for a chance to prove that I belonged here. I had no idea that my journey would help transform not just my own life, but the entire culture of this place. She looked out at the audience, her eyes finding Sarah in the front row. Her mother was beaming with pride, wearing the academic regalia of a full professor and the confident smile of someone who had found her true calling. Today, I'm graduating summa cum laude with a degree in mechanical engineering and a minor in social entrepreneurship. But more importantly, I'm graduating as part of the most diverse, most innovative, most socially conscious class in this institution's history. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Emma's classmates represented every conceivable background, urban and rural, wealthy and working class, native-born and immigrant, traditional and non-traditional. What united them wasn't their origins, but their shared commitment to using their engineering skills to make the world better. We are the generation that will solve climate change, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. We are the generation that will make clean energy accessible to everyone, that will design sustainable cities, that will create technologies that serve all communities, not just the privileged few. But we couldn't do any of this if this institution hadn't learned to see potential in unexpected places, to value diverse perspectives, to understand that innovation comes from inclusion, not exclusion. She told the story of her classmate James, the son of an automotive executive who had initially struggled with practical applications but had learned to combine his theoretical knowledge with hands-on experience to develop revolutionary battery technologies. She told the story of Marcus Thompson, who had overcome his early academic struggles to become the valedictorian and was now heading to MIT for graduate school with a full fellowship. She told the story of Maria Santos, who had used her engineering degree to develop water purification systems that were now being deployed in communities around the world. These stories aren't exceptional, Emma emphasized. They're the new normal. When you create an environment where everyone can succeed, everyone does succeed in ways that benefit not just themselves, but society as a whole. As Emma concluded her speech and accepted her diploma, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. The scared, angry mother who had walked into Professor Thornfield's office 5 years ago had been transformed into a respected educator and advocate. The brilliant but uncertain teenager who had faced prejudice and dismissal had become a confident leader ready to change the world. But perhaps most importantly, the institution itself had been transformed. The elite technical institute was no longer an exclusive club for the privileged few, but a genuine meritocracy that recognized and nurtured talent wherever it was found. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos and celebrations, Professor Thornfield approached Sarah and Emma. He looked older, humbler, but also more at peace with himself. "Professor Martinez-Chan," he said formally, then smiled. "Sarah, I wanted to thank you one more time for the lesson you taught me. Not just about bias and inclusion, but about what it really means to be an educator." "We all learned something, Marcus," Sarah replied, using his first name deliberately. "That's what makes this profession so rewarding. We never stop growing." He turned to Emma. "And congratulations, Emma. You've become everything I should have seen in you from the beginning. I'm sorry it took me so long to recognize your potential." Emma shook his hand warmly. "Professor Thornfield, you taught me something important too, that people can change, that mistakes can become opportunities for growth, that redemption is always possible if you're willing to do the work." As the sun set over the campus, Sarah and Emma walked together one last time as student and parent. Tomorrow, Emma would begin her new job at a clean energy startup, while Sarah would continue her work training the next generation of inclusive engineers. Any regrets? Sarah asked, echoing the question Emma had posed years earlier. Emma considered carefully. Only one. I wish Dad could have seen this. I wish he could have known what his sacrifice made possible. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She rarely spoke about her husband, the NASCAR driver whose death had changed the trajectory of her life, but she knew he would have been proud, not just of Emma's achievements, but of the way she had used her success to lift others up. He does know, Sarah said softly. Every time you help another student overcome barriers, every time you use your skills to solve problems that matter, every time you refuse to accept that things have to stay the way they've always been, he knows. They reached the parking lot where Sarah's car, no longer the old Honda Civic, but a hybrid sedan that reflected both her environmental values and her improved financial situation, waited under the streetlights. So what's next? Emma asked. Sarah smiled, thinking about the new initiatives she was developing, the partnerships she was building, the students she would mentor in the years to come. Next, we keep the door open, she said. We keep fighting for every kid who's been told they don't belong, every student who's been underestimated, every dreamer who's been dismissed, because they don't fit someone else's narrow definition of potential. Together? Emma asked. Together, Sarah confirmed. Always together. As they drove away from the campus, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with injustice and prejudice, with a mother's fierce determination to protect her daughter from the barriers she herself had faced. But it had become something larger, a movement to transform not just one institution, but an entire approach to education and opportunity. The mechanic's daughter had become an engineer, but more than that, she had become a force for change. And the hidden champion had found her voice again, using it not for personal glory, but for collective progress. The road ahead stretched out before them, full of challenges and possibilities, obstacles and opportunities. But they would face it together, mother and daughter, teacher and student, champions of a more just and inclusive future. And somewhere in the distance, other mothers and daughters, other dreamers and strivers, other hidden champions were preparing to walk through doors that Sarah and Emma had helped to open. The story was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning.